1, 15, 2000. Okay, it's coming. It's amazing how the computer works both fast and slow simultaneously, but it's probably just the adjustment of our expectations. Good afternoon to everyone. How's everyone doing?
That's fine.
Okay, so where are we this week? Devarim, or another way of saying it is we're right where we left off last week. We are in the new book of Devarim, also known as Deuteronomy. And the question that we're going to, well, one of the many questions we're going to touch on today is who wrote the book of Deuteronomy? Is it obvious? Well, let me ask you this. Who wrote the book of Genesis? Okay.
We did this Friday, right?
What's that? We have touched on this in many points, but in Deuteronomy it becomes especially important. What would be an alternative answer? All right.
Moses and Joshua.
And then plus with a little bit we might say Joshua, because did Moses write the last few words about himself dying or not? That is a discussion within the tradition as well of whether or not those last few words were finished off. We're not going to get into the traditional arguments about different phrases having been a tikkunei sofrim of things that were slightly modified by later transcribers. We're not going to get into the E source, the P source, the G source, right, and D source, and whatever other sources there are, because, well, that's just a whole nother kettle of fish, or is it ball of wax? In any event, what is the difference between authorship between these two? What does it mean to be an author of a text?
It means your original thought.
Okay,
you're the original writer.
You're the original thought or the original writer. Now, if you say, thought, who's the author of that word? No. Who's the author of the word right here, right now?
You are.
But it was her idea.
Right, but you wrote it.
Oh, no.
So I'm the author?
No, because it's her idea. You just.
So does that mean every secretary who's ever written a letter for their boss is the author of that letter? And every person who was the typesetter and any printing press was the author of that book? Or would we say the person who had the idea, as Andrea said? The idea is usually how we attach authorship, right? The thought equals authorship. Now, that is not such a big issue. Authorship, good enough for English. That's not such a big issue for the first 4 books of the Bible. Because the first 4 books of the Bible, the first, Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, are all very clear that we have God saying this and God doing that and God doing all this other stuff. What happens when we get to the book of Deuteronomy?
These are the words of Moses.
These are the words of Moses, right? We're on page 981, if you want to look at the first page, 981, chapter 1, verse 1 of the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim.
But it was found.
We're not going to get into the idea that somehow there was this propaganda book written. Because if you were writing a propaganda book, you could have done better than this. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that somehow Deuteronomy was the book found during Josephus's renovation, but not that it was found, but that it was written first and only at that time. I completely disagree with that theory. The idea that Deuteronomy might have been part of what they were rediscovering is perfectly fine, but the idea that this was being authored by Josephus's scribes and passed off as a pious forgery, a pious fake, simply I don't think is accurate.
I'm just saying that it was found.
It doesn't say Deuteronomy was found. Yes, the commentary in Fox may say that, and many people have advanced that line of argument, but if you go back and read the book of Kings, it never says, and then we found the book of Deuteronomy. It says they found the book of God, and they realized they had not been following its ways. That could be part of the book, the Torah, or it could be the entire Torah. It is unclear exactly. What was clear was that, yes, prior to it, they really were not following Torah, as we get that very clearly from their history. But I want to get back to this question then of authorship becomes very tricky when we get to the book of Deuteronomy, because up until here, it's clearly been God's thoughts, right? For books 1 to 4. But when we get to book 5, right, that seems to be Moses's words. So it's not God telling Moses, go give this speech. It's Moses giving a speech and then writing it down. So why does it have the same status as the rest of the Torah? Okay, that's what I want in the back of your minds as we begin the book of Deuteronomy. Page 981. And so we're chapter 1, verse 1. Would you mind?
These are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan.
Other side meaning not in the land of Israel, because he doesn't get to come in, remember.
Through the wilderness in the Arabah, and Suf, between Pachan and Tophel, Labah, Hazarot, and Dishpan. It is 11 days from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by the Mount Seir.
Remember, Horeb is the Mount Sinai. So here you can also get an idea of, even by the long route, how long does it take to get from Egypt to Israel?
11 days.
No. We had to get to Mount Horeb in the first place.
Oh.
How long did it take us to get from the Exodus to Mount Sinai?
3 months. 2 months.
We know the exact number.
400.
49 days. Right? Shavuot is the holiday that comes right after Pesach. It's the counting of the Omer. So 49 plus 11 would be 60. 2 months, right? Long route, slow march, 2 months to get from Egypt to Israel. And again, that's Israel also looping around rather than going right up the coastal road through what is now Gaza. So the longest possible route you could pick to get into the land of Israel would take you 2 months. It's taken 40 years. Just bear that in mind as we continue.
It was in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, that Moses addressed the Israelites in accordance with the instructions that the Lord had given him for them. After he had defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and King Og of Bashan, who dwelt in Ashtaroth and Edrei. On the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this teaching. He said,
anytime you see the word capitalized for the word teaching in this particular edition, it's the word Torah. Right? They're translating the word Torah as teaching because the word Torah did not mean Torah originally. The word Torah meant teaching or instruction. That's why we call a teacher in Hebrew Morah. Right? Comes from the same root word. So that's why we end up with this translation of the word Torah into an English word. If you want to keep it as the word Torah, that's fine, but recognize you might be fooling yourself then, because the word Torah is not just a simple concept. It is the whole corpus of instruction and teaching. All right, onward.
So Moses said, the Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, you have stayed long enough at this mountain. Start out and make your way to the hill country of the Amorites, and to all their neighbors in the Arabah, the hill country, the Shephelah, the Negev, the seacoast, the land of the Canaanites, and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. See, I place the land at your disposal. Go, take possession of the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to assign to them and to their heirs after them.
Okay, so he is giving a recount, right? Moses is telling them what has already happened. He's explaining some of the events that have happened over the last 40 years. Does this make sense? Yes, everyone's fine with that?
Yeah.
Borders
he
are
just-
different.
What's that?
The borders are.
All right, so in a previous year, we did go into the details of what description of the actual borders might look like. We're not going to run through that again. If anyone is very interested, email me and I'll send you the notes from that class. But yes, the depiction of the borders is not steady. Partly we know that they're unsteady because if the borders were to be as we sometimes imagine them to be from the most expansive description in either with Abraham or with Moses, then Moses would have already been in the land of Israel. Because after all, if it goes all the way from the Euphrates to the Nile, then he spent most of his life living in Israel. And even when they were wandering, they were in Israel, which of course would then make the whole rest of this narrative pointless when he keeps begging God to let him enter the land of Israel. So there's definitely a concept of greater or lesser Israel, or true Israel and peripheral Israel, or actual Israel and possible Israel. There are many different debates and discussions among the commentators about what these different border markers could possibly mean. But halakhically, Israel proper is definitely a much smaller space than that description would lead you to believe. When it comes to where you actually do the sabbatical, where you do the tithes, where the tribes get their land allocated, that is all within what we would recognize, almost as we would recognize within the modern borders of the state of Israel. The Negev, the tip down at the bottom that goes towards Eilat, that is not considered part of Israel proper. No one would have wanted it anyway back then. And we definitely know that because Moses walked through there a couple times in his life and was never considered to be in Israel. Because otherwise you can't get to the east side of the Jordan without walking through the Negev at some point. Just not physically possible. All right.
And he's just saying, go, take possession of the land.
Right.
Go, take it.
It's time. So remember, the first moments where we came out of Egypt, we went to Horeb, we went to Mount Sinai, we received the Torah, we built the Mishkan, and God said, okay, let's go. We packed up, we headed out, and then we had the spy incident, which didn't go so well. And after that was when we got the 40-year delay. Okay, but so far, it's recapitulation, right? He is simply recounting some of the things that have happened in the past. And Moses is putting them in his own words, right? Everybody still remembering our underlying question here, right? Okay, onward.
Thereupon I said to you.
Right, remember the singular first person, the I, is going to be Moses for much of the book of Deuteronomy, as opposed to many other portions of the Torah where the I is God saying, I'm blah, blah, blah. Right, so Moses is saying, I cannot bear.
So Moses is saying, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. The Lord your God has multiplied you until you are today as numerous as the stars in the sky. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, increase your numbers 1,000-fold and bless you as he promised you. But how can I bear unaided the trouble of you and the burden and the bickering? Pick from each of your tribes men who are wise, discerning, and experienced, and I will appoint them as your heads. You answered me and said, what you propose to do is good. So I took your tribal leaders, wise and experienced men, and appointed them heads over you, chiefs of thousands, chiefs of hundreds, chiefs of 50s, and chiefs of 10s, and officials for your tribes. I charged your magistrate at that time as follows. Hear out your fellow men and decide justly between any man and a fellow Israelite or a stranger. You shall not be partial in judgment. Hear out low and high alike. Fear no man, for judgment is God's. And any matter that is too difficult for you, you shall bring to me, and I will hear it. Thus I instructed you at that time about the various things you should do.
Okay. Wait a minute. What's he describing?
A court?
A court system.
Parashat Yitro.
Parashat Yitro. Wait a minute. Why is that called Parashat Yitro?
Because Yitro made the suggestion to
Yeah.
Moses.
Jethro, his father-in-law,
His father-in-law.
he was the one who came up with the idea of having this system where you'd have the different hierarchy of tens and hundreds and thousands.
And these are the criteria that you're going to use
But-
to pick these people.
Moses didn't mention him here.
No, he didn't.
So wait a minute.
Hmm.
Who's the author?
Oh.
If Moses has just now given us a recount of a story that we know, because we read the book of Exodus not too long ago, and in that book, it was his father-in-law made the suggestion, and then Moses, recognized it, because up until that point, in the version we see in Exodus, Moses is exhausting himself, and it's only Jethro who comes in and says, you know what, you're going to burn out, you need to do something. Here it's like, you know what, I said, I can't handle this on my own. It was like as though it was a self-realization.
Right.
You know what I need to do? You know what would work? It just came to me all by myself. It seems a little, dare we say, inaccurate, right? Is he portraying this incorrectly? Right? Is he misremembering 40 years on what actually happened? Is he deliberately misrepresenting what happened? Is he trying to erase Jethro's role in this? Or is he simply doing a quick synopsis that doesn't need all of the back and forth between himself and his father-in-law, that only needs what the people end up getting, which is, this is the way it's going to be organized? Well, all of those would seem to come down to the author's decision of, this is Moses making a speech, and Moses is choosing, for one of those reasons, personally I think it is the last one, he is choosing to present the story in a way that makes sense in this retelling, when he's talking to this generation. But that's his choice. And you'll notice again, God is not telling him, this is the way you will retell the story. It seems to be Moses is generating that decision on his own. He is making choices as he speaks. And those choices then are the Torah. We good so far? Okay, so that then leads us to another question before we get into this whole deeper question of authorship and all of that, which is, how is Moses making this speech? All right, what is the defining characteristic we know about Moses when it comes to public speaking? He's not good at it, right? He is slow of tongue or heavy-tongued. He maybe stuttered, as many people interpret it. He certainly does not seem to be a great public speaker when we first meet him, way back at the time of the burning bush. And in fact, he kind of gets God angry by how much he says, I can't do it because I'm no good at this. He's had 40 years of practice. So the question, first of all, is, how is he speaking so eloquently now? And for the vast majority of the rest of the book of Deuteronomy, it is also his words in his formulations and his style. How is that happening? And so we're going to talk a little bit in a midrash first about that. So we're on the page that says Israel said, and here Israel is referring to the nation of Israel, the people.
So Israel said, yesterday you said, I am not a man of words, and now you are speaking so much.
All right. So even the nation was a little surprised by Moses's eloquence and perhaps long-windedness. I mean, he was a rabbi after all. And they're saying, wait a minute, I thought you said you weren't a great speaker.
Rabbi Isaac said, if you are impeded in your speech, recite the Torah and you will be healed. This text is related to Isaiah. Then the lame shall leap like a hart, and the tongue of the dumb shall shout for joy. Come and see. All right.
So the come and see is the second part. I should have. I tried to italicize the quote lines, but I seem to have missed it there. So what's he saying here? Is that if you are having trouble speaking, what should you do?
Recite Torah.
Right. Recite, not read. Recite. You need to say it out loud. Now, why does this work?
You already know the words ahead of time.
Right. Well, it's not just like learning them like for reading. It's training your mouth and your mind in certain patterns of expression.
Right.
And if you're wondering whether this actually works, absolutely. If you read Shakespeare 24/7 for a week, you will start doing iambic pentameter.
Oh.
Right? If you read nothing but the swears of sailors, you will find those phrases, again, if you're doing it out loud, God forbid, you will find those phrases leaping to mouth more easily than if you don't. What is the best way to learn how to speak well? To read the best written thing ever out loud so that you get used to speaking in that manner.
Is this related to the power of the Torah as a tree of life?
In so many ways. I mean, but he's giving very concrete speech therapy advice here, which is, if you want to speak well, read something well written out loud, and then you will train yourself to think in that type of speech pattern, and you will train your mouth how to say those words in that kind of way, and you won't stumble over them because it'll be normal for you to use that type of expression, right? It's actually very, very good advice and still used as a speech training technique to this day. And also it's one of the reasons why, if you want to become a good public speaker or a good person who is able to be persuasive, read some of the great speeches of history, and you will get better at it because you will be training yourself to think in those terms and to speak in that manner. So still good advice. And of course, Isaiah talks about the idea that even if you are dumb, remember, dumb did not used to mean stupid, dumb used to mean mute, that you were not able to speak. The idea is that God will open it up and you will be able to shout for joy, even if you used to be mute. Now, we're going to have a little bit more about the exchange between Moses and God on his inabilities.
Come and see. When the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, I will send you unto Pharaoh, Moses said to him, you are doing me an injustice. I am not a man of words.
Right? So he's not just saying, I can't go because I'll fail. He's saying, if I go and fail, that's going to be bad for me. And it's not just Moses doesn't want to be the martyr. Moses also doesn't want to suffer by having to go and humiliate himself publicly. And indeed, to this day, public speaking is still the most common fear among people. Yeah, more people are afraid of having to give a speech than they are of having to hold a spider.
70 languages are spoken in Pharaoh's palace. When I go on your mission, they will examine me, asking me whether I am a representative of the omnipresent. Then it will be revealed to them that I do not know how to converse with them. Will they not laugh at me, saying, look at the agent of the one who created the world and all its languages. Does he not know how to listen and reply? See here, something is wrong.
All right, so basically he's worried that he'll be found out and doubted as God's agent because of his impediments. Right? Because if God is so great, this is the person that comes to speak for him? The guy can't even talk to us. He sounds like either a country bumpkin or someone who is illiterate. Take your pick of derogatory stereotype, but Moses does not feel he will pass muster when he shows up in the court of Pharaoh. And of course, God is going to say,
the Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, but look at the first Adam. Since no creature taught him, where did he come to know 70 languages?
And how do we know that he knows 70 languages?
Because it's stated, and he gave names to them. Names is written in the plural, that is, a name for each and every beast in 70 languages. It is therefore stated in Deuteronomy, these are the words.
All right, so now we can see why Moses is speaking and why they are his words. It's because he has been living with Torah for 40 years. He has been speaking over and over again. He has picked up the right forms, the right phrasing, the right thoughts that allows him to create these amazing words in this book. So we shouldn't be surprised that these are in fact Moses's words in the book of Deuteronomy. We good? Okay. But we still have to be surprised that he would dare to come up with his own words in front of everyone, because there's a very particular incident. The last time he tried to be extemporaneous, he kind of got in trouble.
Rabbi Simon said, when the Holy One, blessed be he, told Moses to repeat the Torah, he was unwilling to rebuke Israel for the evil they had previously done.
Because if you keep reading in this first chapter and so on, you're going to find that Moses lays into them for all of their problems over the last 40 years.
Yeah.
And he might have been a little hesitant to rebuke them.
This may be compared to a student who was walking with his teacher, but he noticed a hot burning coal lying in the road. And thinking it was a precious gem, he picked it up and burned himself. Sometime later, he was again walking with his teacher, and he noticed a precious gem lying in the road. Thinking it was a hot burning coal, he feared to touch it. So his teacher said to him, pick it up, for it is a sparkling jewel. Similarly, Moses argued, when I said to Israel, hear now, you rebels.
Which was at the striking of the rock, and when Moses was then officially prevented from ever entering the land of Israel.
So then I was punished. How then can I think to rebuke them now? God said to Moses, do not be uneasy.
Basically, go ahead and speak. Right? It's okay. Even though the last time you went impromptu, you said, hey, you rebels, which was considered to be a great problem because he wasn't supposed to shame the people he was trying to lead. Nevertheless, God is saying, now you can speak. And when you speak the words of criticism against them, it will be okay. Make sense? All right. So Moses has the ability, because he's been doing it for 40 years and he's been doing Torah over and over, that has trained him to be more eloquent. And God can, after all, make anyone eloquent. And Moses is willing to speak now, even though it has rebuke, because God has given him that permission. But we still don't have why. Why bother doing this at all? Right? And why bother preserving it as part of the Torah? If Moses was just making a farewell speech, why do the rest of us have to hear it? Right? He's not saying farewell to us, and this is not our generation. There must have been 1,000 interactions between Moses and the people of Israel that are not recorded in the Torah. Why record this whole book of Moses's speaking? So Ramban is going to give us a few ideas.
Devarim is a repetition of the Torah, in which Moses explains to the generation that will enter the land most of the mitzvahs that the Jews will need. He does not mention things that concern only the priests, the sacrifices and the laws of purity, which he has already explained to them. The priests were alert and conscientious and would not need such things explained to them over and over again.
Right? I didn't have to repeat all the priestly laws because the priests, they had been paying attention when it first came around. What's that say about the rest of us? Maybe we need another refresher course.
But Moses does issue the same mitzvahs to the Israelites time after time, whether to clarify details of the law or simply to emphasize them by repetition.
All right, so reason number one why he would be giving the speech in the first place is because for the Israelites, they weren't paying attention maybe the first time, second, third, fourth, fifth time, 40 years time. And so the repetition is still important for getting them to either understand in detail or just to pay attention in the first place. Again, for us, maybe not so relevant because we've got the whole rest of the book already nice bound copy. It's not like we're going off oral speaking in our day and age. So I can reread Genesis through Numbers as many hundred times as I need to understand all the things I need to need. So maybe it's not 100% relevant, although certain interpretations of the law demand that we have Deuteronomy. So maybe it is still good for us too.
There are a few mitzvahs in Devarim that have not been previously mentioned.
Now that's a more important but also surprising. So if Moses is the guy who's coming up with this, does that mean he's inventing commandments? Huh. If these mitzvahs haven't been mentioned prior to the book of Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy is being written by Moses as he speaks, then where are these mitzvot coming from?
Oh, because all of these were told to him at Sinai or in the tent of meeting in the very first year before the incident with the spies. Nothing new is given to Moses here in the steppes of Moab. That is why we do not find in this book the expression, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them," or instruct the Israelites to do such and such a mitzvah.
Right, so the standard opening phrase of so many of the verses of the middle part of the Torah, from the moment that we are taken out of Egypt, is, and God told Moses, command the Israelites, say, fill in the commandment. And what Ramban is arguing here is that you don't find that phrase in the book of Deuteronomy. You don't find Moses being told, and now tell them that, which means, in his interpretation, that all of these mitzvot were given earlier. They just weren't written down in the chronological order in which they were given. They're just now being written down as part of the compilation as Moses makes his final speech. But it's not him originating them. It is simply this is where they first appear in writing. Does that make sense? Okay. But then we have to have the question, why weren't they written down, chronologically when they were first given? Although you should also ask yourself that there were numerous mitzvot that were not written down chronologically. The daughters of Zelophehad, which we just talked about, a few different parshiot in the last few weeks, those were written almost, again, 40 years after Sinai, and yet certainly those were still part of the commandments that God gave.
The reason the new mitzvahs were not mentioned is perhaps because these mitzvahs are not everyday occurrences, so that Moses did not mention them until it was time for the generation of the children of those who left Egypt to take possession of the land.
Right? So if I need to know to put a parapet on my roof, that's not very useful while we're living in tents and sukkot, in huts, right? Because there's no one walking on my roof when I'm living in a sukkah. If they are, the parapet's not going to help them. They're just right through the branches. And the same thing with my tent. So Ramban's explanation is the reason why the mitzvot are here is because they weren't needed to be written earlier, and God is organizing things as we need to have them. And Moses, being his agent and having studied Torah now for 40 years and understanding how to speak, has likewise brought it at the right time in the right way to the right group. Make sense? Okay. And that is going to lead us now to Abarbanel, again, trying to clear up for us this whole authorship question.
The question is whether this book is from heaven, like the first 4 books, or whether, since it is all in Moses' voice, that these are the words of Moses and not of God. In fact, Moses told Israel all these things because he was soon to part from them.
right? So what he's saying here is that God did not command Moses to tell us the book of Deuteronomy, right? This was Moses's choice. He wanted to say goodbye. And before he said goodbye, he had a lot of things to tell us. And that was Moses's idea.
Well, also, none of these people there could take notes as they were going along for 40 years. So he's reminding them of all the things, because otherwise, if you can't write it down and review it again, how are you going to know?
And you want to make sure people remember, because this is important stuff.
Yeah, this is pretty important. After Moses had finished, the Holy One wanted them as part of the Torah. So the Holy One dictated them to Moses, perhaps adding a few things, and Moses wrote them into the Torah at the command of the Almighty, who announced, "These, no more and no less, are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel." The introductory verses, 1 through 5, in the third person, testify that Moses' words in this book are divine, just like the rest of the Torah.
Right. Remember, the first few verses don't say, "These are my words." It's, "These are the words of Moses." They're in the third person, right? His words.
That's right.
So that is clearly not being written by Moses about himself. It's being written by a third party, in this particular case, God. So the idea is, yes, Moses made his speeches, and God said, "That was a great speech. Write it down. And here's how you're going to write it." So God redictated, according to Abarbanel, what Moses had already said, in order that there would be a permanent and lasting record of what Moses said on his own. So essentially, God is giving the stamp of approval and the stamp of divinity to the speeches that Moses is about to make. But because God gave full approval to it and did a little editing to make sure it all fit in a logical format, that is still considered to be God's Torah. Make sense?
Yeah.
It's a very neat solution, in my opinion.
The difference between "these are the words that Moses addressed" versus "these are the words of Moses."
Well,
Those are different things. These are the words that Moses spoke.
right.
Doesn't necessarily come to the conclusion that these are Moses' words. He's the original author.
Yes, I mean
Yes,
you can argue that these are the words that he happened to say, but he was merely parroting them on behalf of God. Right.
This is what God.
But like I said, and we've seen, most of the commentators agree that these are Moses' own words, which in one way or another God gave approval to, which is why they were considered to be part of the canon, part of the Torah itself in its lasting form. All right. One more explanation of why this order is the way it is.
And as to the fact that these certain precepts were not mentioned in the first books of the Torah, the root reason for this matter is that the Torah embraces all the wisdom, apart from the plain meaning of its sweet themes and the mighty foundations of its precepts. And perhaps on this account it is necessary that its sections and letters should be located where they are, all being precisely arranged by the divine master of wisdom, blessed is he.
All right, so Sefer HaHinuch tries to argue, I don't know. There's a wisdom to why certain commandments were given back in Exodus, certain were given in Leviticus, certain were given in Numbers, and certainly only showed up in Deuteronomy in a repetition that implies they were given before, but we didn't hear them before.
Yeah.
There must be some reason in God's wisdom of why it was organized like this. He's saying that because all of the Torah is a unified whole, right? It is all a unified reflection that is sharing what God wants us to know of God's wisdom and guidance for this world. And there's more to it than just a list. There's more to it than just A happened and then B and then C. There is something else that happens in the insights that come by the unique combination of phrasing and events and narrative together with law and different topics cropping up in different places that gain more than the sum of the sum of the parts, right? The totality is more than the sum of the parts. And there's a wisdom to the editing that maybe we can't fully appreciate, but which God could. And so that means we shouldn't be surprised that the Torah does not read like a book that has been edited by a very sterile mind. We should instead expect that there will be a complexity to its composition that gives us more insights than if it were just list, 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 list. Make sense? Okay. Which means then, as we read the book of Deuteronomy, we have to have that in our mind. Not only the idea that this was what Moses chose to share, but this is what God chose to be shared in this manner, rather than sharing it in other forms. And that idea is where we're going to sort of finish here with this last very long excerpt. The original is even longer, from Kedushat Levi, a great Hasidic teacher, about how we should approach any text in the Torah, and not only the mitzvah type laws, but that as well. All right, so we all ready for a good lesson on how to read? Okay.
When reading the Holy Torah, we have to distinguish between matters treated by the Torah as more profound than immediately visible after a superficial reading of the text. That is, something mystical, something buried deep inside, and matters that every reader can understand at once, like references to places, dates, such as when the Torah relates the details of the lives of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Okay,
so let's try and unpack what he's trying to say here. Right? It's a long sentence. So he's saying there's lots of material in the Torah, and some of it is really easy to understand very, very quickly. A date, a name, a place, right? Some of the events seem very, very clear. And then Abraham walked too. Right? Boom, I know what's going on, right? But there are other matters which take a great more effort, and a superficial understanding would not get you all the information from the text that you really need to get from the text, right? That superficiality is doing a crime to the text. And the Torah wants us to dig, to find its mysteries that are buried inside of it. That's one reason why you come to this class, is so we can dig together. But he's trying to say there are these different ways to read the texts, depending upon what they are. But even some of the superficial things, the things that are just dates, places, people, those also have merit, as he's going to continue with.
When the Torah reports about their respective dealings with Lavan, or stories told about the matriarchs, these are not to be understood only at face value, but they contain deeply hidden aspects. Learn from the excerpts of Abraham's life how to practice loving kindness with our fellow man. Similarly,
let's just make sure we understand what he's saying here. It's like, okay, fine. Abraham sat in his tent, 3 people showed up, he gave them food, and then they went. Boom. I know the story, I'm done. Yes, but the Torah didn't give you the story just so you knew what happened in Abraham's diary on that day. The Torah gave you that story so that you would learn something from it. You would learn the essence of what it is to be kind to someone from that story, right? So there's a story that just relates the events. It's what I like to call the journalistic account. And then there's a story that actually tells you, or that actually gives you the content of the meaning of the lesson. Right, what we would call a parable, or an allegory, or a fable. You know, all the things that are meant to give a lesson of instruction. Right now, all of those other terms are not exactly appropriate to the Torah, but the idea that when you read it, you're supposed to be getting something from it other than a historical account is what Kedushat Levi is trying to tell us here. Good? Good. So when we read through, we better be getting deeper lessons than just A follows B. Onward.
Similarly, there are many attributes practiced by our matriarchs which we are to emulate by immersing ourselves more deeply in the stories of the Torah than one does by reading a novel.
Right? Just like I like to tell when I'm working with the kids, I said, if you read Harry Potter, your brain goes into neutral and you just let the words carry you along.
Yeah.
Right? That's what a novel is. Right? Unless you're reading some novel that has, the pretension of being, deeper. Most novels are just there to carry you along as an entertainment. Same thing with most movies. You're a passive passenger in the story that is going forward. And it's just, this is entertaining. This is interesting. Wow, I never thought of, magic like that. Okay, fine. But that's not how the Torah works, right? In the Torah, you're not a passenger in the story. You are an active participant in understanding that there was a reason for this story in particular to have been preserved and carried forward and shared with you. And if you haven't found that reason yet, you're not reading hard enough. And that is true. Sometimes it can take a lifetime to truly understand what message you're supposed to be getting from certain parts. But you have to understand there is a message in every part. Good.
Proper reading of these stories helps us understand that we are, until this day, benefiting by the merits accumulated by our forefathers, some of which we, as their descendants, are being rewarded for. In its introduction to Megillah
Eicha.
Eicha, Lamentations, the author, quoting the above verse from Jeremiah, interprets it as God's promise to bring redemption to Rachel's descendants on account of her merits.
This is the idea of Rachel weeping as the children are being led into exile. So what he's adding here is that in addition to the specific lessons of each story and each encounter, there is also the meta lesson, the larger issue, which is that by the wonderful behaviors of these people, we still benefit, right? Our lives have been enriched by their decisions, and we are still the beneficiaries of that. It's as though your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents had made an investment, and you're still getting the dividends. Good?
Sure.
Good. Onward.
If the Torah took the trouble to relate fragments from the lives of the patriarchs and matriarchs to teach us to emulate their virtues, it wrote of Balaam's conduct in order to teach us not to emulate the abuse Balaam had made of his freedom of choice.
Right, because this is answering the other question, which is, okay, fine, I learned a lot from studying Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. What do I learn from studying Pharaoh? What do I learn from studying Balaam? These bad people, right? What great messages learning about them being rotten folks?
Abraham's virtues are worth emulating, whereas Balaam's great intellectual gifts, due to their being abused by their owner, must be shunned.
Right, which is the old aphorism, which is everyone can serve as an example, even if it's as a bad example.
Or example of what not to do.
Exactly. Right. So yes, you can learn from everyone, even if it's just don't be like that person. Right. There's always a truth in everyone's life, even if it's the opposite of their behavior. All right.
Okay. In other words, although we are able to derive much value from just reading the text superficially, what is hidden behind such superficial reading of the text is even more illuminating.
Right, which, as I've said many, many times, is why it's so frustrating when people say, I just want to read the text by itself. I just want to read, the text alone. I don't want I don't want additional interpretation and commentary that changes the text. I just want to read what it means. It's like, that doesn't work. What it means is the depth, right? The superficial is important, absolutely, but it's also one layer. You're not done when you do that.
Similarly with the parts of the Torah that on the surface purport to teach God's mitzvahs. Although we must, of course, use the text in order to know which mitzvahs to perform and when and where, the text contains many hidden nuances that are discovered only when we apply ourselves with the intention to discover them.
So if you read just, the idea of take the blood out of the animal before you eat it, and you just say, okay, that's my to-do list today, take blood out, done. And you go no further than that of why? What is God trying to tell us? What does this mean about my relationship to God? What does this mean about my relationship to blood as a symbol of the soul? What does this mean about my relationship to the animal? If you don't ask those other questions, you don't try to probe any further, then you may still be doing the mitzvah. And yes, full points, excellent, great. But you're also kind of missing part of what God was hoping you would understand by giving you the mitzvah. Right? The mitzvah is absolutely there to guide and direct our actions so that they are correct and proper, but they are also there to direct our understanding. But you have to think that it's trying to give you understanding, or else you'll just read through it like it was reading the instruction manual for, an IKEA furniture. And just, all right, insert screw and try. Okay. No, there's meaning here, even for the most mundane sounding commandments.
This also hints that we must not only look for something deeper beyond the bare text in the stories the Torah tells us about outstanding personalities, but search for deeper meaning in the text teaching the mitzvahs. There is a lesson to be learned, not only regarding how to perform the mitzvah, but also regarding moral, ethical lessons to be derived from each mitzvah.
Okay, and it's going to go on to elaborate from the Zohar.
From the Zohar, it says, it is interesting to note that the fifth book of the Torah is also known as Review of the Torah.
Right, what's the fifth book of the Torah?
Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy, where we are, right? So one of the nicknames of Deuteronomy is Mishneh Torah, the review of the Torah, right? Because as we've talked about already, a lot of what was in the first four books gets repeated in one form or another in the last book.
In this book, the emphasis is not so much on the attributes of outstanding human beings, but on the attributes of the Creator and his relationship to his chosen people under various circumstances.
Which, if you read through the book of Deuteronomy shortly after having read the first 4 books, which hopefully you're doing, should ring a bell. Like, wait a minute, you're right. Once we get into Deuteronomy, it's like the story just freezes. Right? We don't hear about the comings and goings and the travels and the behaviors and the incident of this and the incident of that. It's just like a long speech. It's like a long, it's very didactic rather than giving me the context of the story. It's a total shift of narrative style from what we had in the first 4 books. That is one of the reasons, I will point out, of why in the biblical criticism school, they argue that this was a completely different author than the first 4 books, because they say this last book just doesn't read like the first 4. Notice our tradition also noticed that this one doesn't read like the first 4, but we have a very different explanation. The first 4 were giving us all sorts of issues, ideas about how people behave, the great leaders and the not so great people. This one is talking more about our relationship with God than about the people who we're using as instructional examples. Onward, though.
Knowing the manner in which God relates to his people is the key to all the warnings issued by Moses to the people concerning their deviating from the right path and the consequences which this would bring in its wake sooner or later, whenever God's patience in waiting for the people to repent would come to an end.
Which, of course, we will commemorate this coming Saturday night and Sunday with Tisha B'Av, with our commemoration of Tisha B'Av. Remember, 9 p.m. Saturday night, 9 a.m. Sunday morning, both services for the community this year being held at Ohev Shalom.
Since the book of Deuteronomy was addressed at that time to the generation of Israelites who had not been adults at the time of the Exodus, or who had not even been born at that time yet, they did not need to have everything spelled out for them by means of stories in the Torah, that is, parables, according to Moses' own testimony in Deuteronomy. They had become a generation that could use their eyes and ears, not only physically. This was a generation that was not tainted by the ritual pollution it had taken out with them from Egypt.
All right, so you can imagine the rather immature spiritual life of the Israelites who had grown up in the land of Egypt. They needed to hear about Adam and Noah. They needed to hear about Abraham and Isaac. They needed the stories. They needed the other ways of instructing them in good moral behavior in order to lift them up out of that muck of Egypt.
Yeah.
But 40 years on, you got people who weren't born into that, people who have grown up with the Torah as natural, people who have grown up with Moses as the leader for the entire nation. They're standing in a place that their parents didn't stand. Right? They are able to understand. They can use their eyes and ears and understand correctly in ways that their parents couldn't, and who needed more of a training wheels version, if you will, of some of the commandments. And so therefore, Deuteronomy reads differently because it had a different audience. Right? Again, same ultimate author, obviously God, but the style and structure are different because it was being addressed to a different group. And you shouldn't be surprised that if you have the same person talking to a group of kindergartners and that same person talking to a group of college professors, even if they're talking about the same topic, they might present it in a different manner because hopefully professors can understand at a different level than kindergartners, right? Even if we're talking on the same topic. Makes sense, right? Okay.
So this is how we must understand Breshit Rabbah, that wherever the Torah commences a paragraph with the words these, it signifies conditions that had existed prior to this point that had now become completely irrelevant.
Right. So Bereshit Rabbah, great compilation of early midrashim, uses the phrase ele, right? These, as saying every time the Torah starts a section with that phrase, it is telling you that what's happening now is a break from what happened before. Right? This is a midrashic principle. Whenever you see that word at the start of a section, it's telling you, bam, we're changing things. Right? Something has shifted from what was before to what we're doing now. And
so when we apply this to Deuteronomy, it means that rules that had been relevant to the people who had left Egypt as adults no longer had any relevance.
I was to say how they would be talked to, how they would be shown the way to live.
The present generation was on a spiritually so much higher level that Moses could speak to them without having to use parables.
Hence the shift in style of the writing.
Oh.
Make sense? Right. So when you read through the book of Deuteronomy, you may be thinking to yourself, I know all this. We already did this for the last 4 books, right? I recognize that mitzvah, sure. Just keep reading, keep reading, keep reading. No, right? From a variety of our sources, we can see that Deuteronomy is special, partly because it is Moses' own words. And how cool is it that we get to get what he wanted to say, not just what God told him to say. It's kind of nice that his voice comes through. 2, we shouldn't be surprised that God organized the giving of this knowledge in a way that might not be how a textbook would do it, because God is aiming for a much higher standard of wisdom than just a textbook. And there are reasons why it might have been more relevant for some of these mitzvot to be mentioned to that generation or emphasized to that generation rather than their parents. But mostly because anytime we read any section of Torah, there is always something deeper to it than just the surface statement that it's trying to make. The surface statement, of course, should never be ignored. Right? There are people who go straight to allegory and miss the surface. That's not our way of reading either. But we do need to recognize that there is a deeper, if we are going to get everything from the Torah that we can possibly get. And that should hopefully be a vote of confidence to us. Just like God and Moses were willing to speak in a more adult language in Deuteronomy to the generation that had come out, then the generation who come out of Egypt, that their children could be spoken to more in a more complex manner. We should also thank God that we're now at the end of our Torah reading cycle for this year, going to see the Torah in a more adult manner, if you will, a more spiritually mature manner, and we need to rise to the occasion. We need to be willing to engage with it on that level, and not just saying, oh, I really missed the story of the talking donkey. That's great. I like Bilam's story with the donkey too, but sometimes we should also appreciate when someone is talking to us in this more mature manner and rise to that occasion. And that is how we'll get the most out of the book of Deuteronomy as we go forward. Any last questions, comments? Okay, great. See you all, hopefully for Shabbat, for Tisha B'Av, and next week.